Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole, 4th District of Oklahoma, and this is another one of our weekly congressional chats. This is actually coming to you literally Thursday morning, and please forgive me if I look kind of ragged and sound a little tired. I literally have been up 26 straight hours. The big item of this week, and probably the biggest matter this Congress will deal with, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, was passed through the House this morning, 215 to 214, one person voting present. Literally one member missed the vote because he'd been up all night long. He thought the debate would go a little bit longer. He went back to his office, fell asleep, and actually missed the vote. So it's very sad because he's been a very key player in the legislation and won some big concessions that were important to his home state. But it's actually why I stayed in my office in the Capitol building as opposed to coming back to my personal office in Rayburn. I didn't want to run that risk. It's pretty easy to fall asleep when you've been up all day and then you're up all night. Let's talk a little bit about the bill itself and what the process is going forward. The bill is really an extraordinarily consequential piece of legislation. It's got essentially four components to it. The first component, and the one you'll hear the most about, are major tax reform and tax reduction issues. It makes all the tax cuts associated with President Trump's 2017 tax bill permanent, so we won't be revisiting those. It also added new things that the president had talked about during his recent campaign in 2024. Things like no taxes on tips, no taxes on Social Security below a certain income level, a whole range of business incentive taxes that the hope is will spur hiring and economic development. So that's section one. The tax piece is undoubtedly the biggest piece. Second element is a lot of savings. That is changes in mandatory spending, things for Medicaid, not so much restructuring the program and certainly not cutting benefits, but doing things like if you're an illegal alien, you can't get Medicaid if you're not eligible. And so it's tightening up. It really is, waste, fraud, and abuse centered kinds of reforms. You'll hear a lot of alarmist legislation about this, but look, we know the error rate is very high. For instance, even a state like Oklahoma, we estimate, and honestly, the state of Oklahoma estimates 10% of the people that are on Medicaid aren't legally entitled to be there. So states are going to have to sort of step it up and do a better job of screening, because honestly, some of the dollars the federal government spends, and the federal government pays for most of Medicaid. It's supposed to be a state federal relationship, but it's gotten much heavier on the federal side in recent years. So one of the things in there is that states have to lower these error rates, or they'll pay a price, and so that's a good thing. That's to encourage states to do the right thing. There's also, everything from, additional revenue from mineral exploration on federal lands, things of that nature, but genuinely quite a bit of reduced saving or spending over the long term, particularly in mandatory programs. But again, associated on waste, fraud, and abuse, not on benefit cuts. The third big area of the bill is actually regulatory reform. A lot of the things that inhibit economic development are slow permitting processes. We stopped leasing oil and gas lands, or oil and gas leases that are on federal land, offshore, that sort of thing. All those things speed up and make it easier to produce energy. There are other regulatory reforms in the bill, so it's pretty major. And then, final element of the bill is actually a spending portion of the bill, focused on two areas. Additional money for defense over a 4-year period to modernize, upgrade American defense, to look at and start the initial process of creating what the president likes to call the Golden Dome, which is really missile defense for the United States, but a whole host of modernization efforts, new procurement processes, things of that nature that just honestly need to get done, particularly since we're increasingly in a competition with China and Russia. It's one thing to fight terrorists that don't have air forces and don't have artillery. It's quite another thing if you're dealing with potential conflicts with near-peer powers like China and like Russia. So a lot there, and then a lot on the southern border as well. And this is all money dedicated to things like finishing the wall, extra border patrol personnel, better technology on the border. And frankly, they're done in this kind of a bill. Largely, the way Congress works, these things are national priorities, but to get the money for them, quite often Democrats, demand additional spending in other areas. And so in the normal appropriations process, which I'm intimately involved with as chairman of the appropriations, there's a lot of bipartisanship, but that means you can't always get what you need without paying something for it. Democrats, by the way, did the same thing. In the American Rescue Plan, they spent $1.9 trillion outside the normal appropriations process. Not a dime of that went for defense or border security. Same thing happened the very next year. They did the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, another $700 billion, mostly green energy projects, not a dime for defense, not a dime for a more secure border. So again, think of it as four things: tax cuts for sure, regulatory reform, entitlement savings to help pay for the tax cuts, and then finally a major spending component that will upgrade defense and the border. Obviously, putting together a coalition to do that was extremely difficult. The margin, we could only afford to lose 3 votes in the House of Representatives because, again, reconciliation is usually a partisan only thing. And I have to really tip my hat to a number of people. First, our leadership team, obviously headed by Speaker Johnson, but another real driver in this was our majority leader, Steve Scalise. He really began working on this whole process over a year ago, well before we knew Donald Trump would be elected, but we thought he would, well before we knew we could take the Senate, and well before we were even certain we would hold the House. Steve saw this as a possibility and thought we needed to prepare for it. We did, and that's really the reason why we could put forward such a comprehensive package. 11 different committees were involved in this. All of them had to save money, reduce spending someplace, and they had pretty aggressive targets. And again, that enabled us to, quote, pay for the tax cut. So again, a Herculean effort, a lot of negotiation. If you followed this at all, you heard everything from, there's the ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party wanted to cut more, and honestly, in many ways, they were right, but we just couldn't get 218 votes to go as far as they wanted to go. We had other Republicans living in blue states, in New York, California, New Jersey, Illinois. They wanted to raise the exemption for state and local taxes. It's pretty controversial and very expensive. On the other hand, we had to have their votes, and they had to have something they could take home to their constituents. They live in very competitive districts. So the political calculations and balancing and persuasion that had to be done was pretty intensive. And there's 2 people I give most of the credit for in that regard. And that's first the Speaker, who, God bless his soul, met with everybody, talked with everybody, found a middle ground, worked with group after group. And then the President of the United States. This was President Trump's main initiative. He's the one that agreed with our leadership and frankly with our committee chairs, I'm going to talk about them in a minute, that this needed to be one big bill. And while they managed it, put together the bill, and then got it down to use football terminology, to about the 10-yard line, we're in the red zone, When you're there, you give the ball to the big guy, and that's the President of the United States, and he's the one that hammered home the final votes and actually secured the passage. We literally had people visiting with the President yesterday afternoon in the White House, he was on the phone with people, very hands-on, very engaged. So no question, a huge win for the President, huge win for Speaker Johnson and our leadership. But I have to single out, again, some committee chairs that did some extraordinary things. The first one will be Jason Smith, who's the chair of Ways and Means. And Chairman Smith, a good friend of mine, really quite able younger guy, and it was even an upset when he became chairman of that very, very powerful committee. But he has had the vision. He's the one that said, we got to put all the eggs in one basket. We got to go in one bill. A lot of people were arguing for two bills. That's what the Senate wanted to do. His argument was, you do that, you'll get one bill, and the other one will be too hard and people will quit. We got to make it. We're not going to give people the goodies. That is, the things, everybody was kind of for the defense stuff. Everybody was for the border stuff. But when you start having to actually cut and save money, people are less certain. And there was a lot of division over things like state and local tax. But he's the one that helped craft the basic strategy. And then the guy that had to make the toughest decisions in terms of reducing spending was a guy named Brett Guthrie, who's the chairman of Energy and Commerce. Brett's actually a very close friend of mine, and for those of you, he's got an Oklahoma connection. He a West Point grad. He trained in the field artillery at Fort Sill, and always asked me about, can you still get Mears burgers in Lawton, and is the plantation still open as a place to eat at Medicine Park? So he knows our state very well, but couldn't be prouder of his effort. The people on that team had to make some really hard decisions. Along the way, while this is primarily driven by Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce, other committees did quite a bit, and our delegation, had some pretty big wins in it or played big roles. Frank Lucas certainly played a big role. Agriculture had to make some really tough calls, and nobody trusts anybody more than Frank Lucas, particularly in this area. He's not just the voice for Oklahoma agriculture. He's seen in the House as the voice for rural America and agriculture in general. Played a big role on the Ag Committee, where he's a very influential person as the former chairman of the full committee. He and I worked together. One of the original proposals was to retroactively change pension plans for federal employees. That's just wrong. You don't do that. And, people pay by the rules. You want to change things going forward for new employees coming on. That's something to consider. But Frank and I both felt very, very strongly. And we both visited with our leadership, visited with the whip on this, and guess what? We got that struck from the bill. And there were other people that had similar concerns. If you represent a lot of federal employees, and I do, then you had that concern. But it's even beyond that. You just don't do that to people. If they've played by the rules and they've done their part, then you don't change the rules, particularly if they're approaching retirement. They're in their 40s and 50s. But you don't do it any time. You play under the system that you signed into, and you might modify it and change it over time. We've done that before. Nothing wrong with that. But we're not going to, after the fact, change the rules in the middle of the game, so to speak. So I was pleased to do that. Honestly, we kept that low key, and it was done quietly. But it was a big sigh of relief in our office when the bill text came out and the changes that Frank and I asked for and worked hard to secure actually happened. So, we got to play a role there. But, I would tell you every individual member of our delegation had important roles. Kevin Hearn was a big player on the whole tax package. He's our representative on Ways and Means. Stephanie Weiss, again, very able, contributed every step along the way. Josh Burkeen was one of the more conservative members and was a holdout on the bill, but he got some concessions that were important. And honestly, long term, we're going to save the country money. So he stepped up, and then when we needed the vote, and we absolutely needed just about every vote, got it passed. So it was a pretty remarkable team effort. Now, having said all of that, talked about the substance of the bill, talked about the process here, you have to sort of lean back and remember, to become law, you have to do more than just pass the House of Representatives. This now goes to the United States Senate, but it gets there on time. Speaker Johnson said we would get this done by Memorial Day, and we did. Now it's up to the Senate, and they've been working on this. But I will tell you that this is not a criticism. They haven't worked as long or as we have. They were more focused on capturing the majority when we were working on this bill last year. So I actually think the bill we passed out of the House will largely survive intact. But it's still up to the Senate. I mean, they can do what they think the right thing is. They're not concerned about SALT. No Republican senators represent California, New Jersey, or Illinois. On the other hand, again, our members, New Jersey, from those states, and New York in particular, are the difference makers. And remember, we passed this 215 to 214. If the Senate changes it very much, has to come back to the House, and we might not be able to reassemble that coalition. So the ball is now very much in the Senate's court, and the goal is to pass this legislation by July 4th. So they basically have, what's left in May, which is not a lot with the Memorial Day weekend coming up, and then the month of June, and that's about it to resolve their many issues. And if they take longer than that, then the impact of the bill will be delayed, and the risk of the train running off the tracks, legislatively speaking, I think is much greater. So again, they've got serious work to do, but I think they can get it done, and hopefully they can get it done by July 4th, certainly by the August break, which I know some of them see that as a more realistic goal. Last thing I will mention, of course, I'm deeply involved in appropriations. That's been overshadowed, appropriately so, by all this, but we did release a schedule that we will mark up the funding bills for in June and July. Our aim is to get that across the line. We did announce, or have made it clear, that we're going to be appropriating basically at the president's top line level. We've not done the allocations by individual subcommittee. We'll also provide the president what he asked for in the defense portion of the bill in terms of dollars, but obviously there will be changes, there always are, in bills this major. So the process of actually putting them together is underway. But broadly speaking, we're going to try and work with the president and the administration as closely as we can. Our bills will actually spend a little bit. We cut spending last year. We're going to try and cut it again this year, at least in the House. We'll see what the Senate comes up with, and then in the fall we'll sit down and negotiate things through. But this win on the reconciliation bill gives us a little bit of momentum, I think, going into appropriation. But it's a tricky, complex thing, and while reconciliation has been a partisan exercise, it always is, appropriations has to be bipartisan. So it'll start one place as we introduce them, but they'll be bargaining not only within the Republican coalition, but across partisan lines, and certainly with the United States Senate. So the bill will evolve over the course of the summer. But the first thing to do is get them written and get them out of committee, and then see what the Senate does, see what the House as a body, once we get them out of committee, they got to go to the floor, and members quite appropriately will have amendments, spending they don't want, additional spending they do want. So it's a very lengthy and complex process. But again, this was a huge victory from a Republican standpoint. Had we not been able to achieve this, it would have been a gigantic setback for the president, a gigantic setback for the Republican majority in the House, and a lot of people would start labeling the second Trump administration as a failure off the bat. So, big step in the right direction. this morning, literally Thursday morning, and we'll see where we go from here. But I can tell you, there's a lot of happy Republicans and a lot of Democrats that aren't happy and are doubling down to keep fighting, and that's appropriate. That's how our system works. But I think this is a good deal for the economy. I think it's a good deal for the American people. I think it's the right thing to do, and now I'm wishing our Republican colleagues in the Senate well as they do their part and pass this bill with whatever changes they think are appropriate, and then we finalize it. But sooner is better in terms of getting this done, and it's our hope that they will largely take what's been accomplished in the House and accept it. But again, that's their call in the Senate. We would like it to go through and not have to do this again. And if they change it too much, we will. So anyway, again, very, very good week. Couple of things I also want to mention. We had a tragedy as we're working all this through in Washington, D.C. You've seen a young couple literally on the verge of being married, Jewish, murdered by an anti-Semite, outside a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C. I mean, outrageous, heartbreaking that something like that could happen in our country. They've apprehended the person who appears to have been the culprit, and he's in the hands of the Justice Department now. We'll go from there. But great tragedy in that regard. Also, a personal loss. Most of you will never have heard of a guy named Jerry Connolly. He's one of my colleagues from Virginia, a Democrat, was elected in 2008. Like me, he's former congressional staffer. In his case, he actually worked in the Senate for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was a local politician here in Virginia, and then served with great distinction in Congress. And I don't know anybody in the Congress on either side of the aisle that didn't like Jerry Connolly. He's quick wit, smart, funny, great sense of humor. Would always, if you've ever watched House proceedings, when he'd get up, he would kind of go, "Mr. Speaker," and kind of, and it would always make everybody laugh because it wasn't his normal voice, but it was kind of a parody of what people sometimes do. And he just had a way about him. And we lost him to cancer. It came very suddenly. Honestly, he passed much more quickly than any of us thought would be the case. So I want to certainly extend my thoughts, my prayers, my condolences to his family, to his friends. He had a lot of them, not just here in Virginia, but all across the country, because again, he was a very, very well-liked and well-respected member of Congress, and we're going to miss him. But he certainly made a heck of a contribution while he was here. So with that, I wish you and your family well. I hope things are going well for you. And if we can ever be of help, please don't hesitate to call our office. But until we talk again in the near future, good luck, God bless, and look forward to our next visit.